The coin hit the wooden workbench with a sharp, ringing sound that seemed to echo through the entire barn like a pistol shot, and Rebecca Hawkins watched Patrick Sheridan's jaw tighten in a way she had never seen before. Not in 3 years of being his nearest neighbor. Not through the drought of 1882 or the harsh winter that followed it. Not through any of the quiet, careful negotiations that life on the Wyoming frontier demanded. But right now, in the amber afternoon light of his smithy, with the smell of iron and coal hanging between them like a third person in the room, that single silver dollar she had placed on his bench seemed to have broken something she had not even known existed. "Take it back," he said, and his voice was low, almost dangerously soft. Rebecca lifted her chin. She had ridden 4 miles in a torn dress because her harness had snapped clean through and her mare had stumbled badly on the back trail, and she had swallowed an enormous amount of pride just to knock on Patrick Sheridan's door and ask for help. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had buried a husband, managed a homestead alone for 2 years, and survived a Wyoming winter that had killed 3 of her cattle and most of her hope. She did not ask for help, and she did not accept charity. "It is a fair price," she said. "More than fair, I should think, for the quality of the work." And the work was extraordinary. She could see it from where she stood. The harness lay mended on the far side of the bench, the broken leather sections restitched and reinforced with a doubled length of rawhide, and the buckle that had sheared in half had been replaced with a new iron clasp he had clearly forged himself, still slightly warm to the touch when she had examined it. It was better than it had been before it broke. It was better than anything she could have bought at the mercantile in Clearwater for twice the price. "Take it back, Rebecca," he said again, and this time he pushed the coin toward her with 2 fingers, not looking at her, looking at the harness instead as if it might suddenly explain itself to him. "Patrick, I am not a charity case." He looked up then, and the force of his dark eyes hitting hers was almost physical. There was something behind them she had not anticipated. Not irritation, not stubbornness. Something that looked terrifyingly almost like pain. "Neighbors," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with extreme deliberation, "do not keep accounts between them." The silence that fell after those words was the loudest thing Rebecca Hawkins had ever heard. She had not always been Rebecca Hawkins of the Clearwater Valley. She had been Rebecca Aldine of Laramie, the youngest daughter of a schoolteacher who had believed in reading and mathematics and the fundamental dignity of every human being, regardless of what the territory around him thought about such notions. She had grown up in a house full of books and arguments, where her father debated every passing pastor and sheriff and railroad man who came through, and she had absorbed from him a bone-deep certainty that accounts mattered, that fairness mattered, that you did not take something without giving back. She had married Thomas Hawkins at 23, which her mother had called young and her father had called reasonable, and Thomas had been a kind man if not a remarkable one. He had a homestead claim in the valley north of Clearwater, good bottomland with a creek running through the eastern edge of it, and he had worked it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the land was not going to hurry for anyone. They had been happy enough. She had not been the kind of woman who required grand passion. She had required decency and consistency, and the occasional conversation about something other than cattle prices, and Thomas had given her most of those things most of the time. Then Thomas had died in the summer of 1881, a fever that took him in 5 days, and Rebecca had found herself 26 years old and entirely alone on 320 acres of Wyoming grassland with 2 horses, a milk cow, 11 cattle, and a mortgage she had not known existed. The mortgage was the hidden betrayal that had almost broken her. Thomas had borrowed against the property from a land company in Cheyenne, a company called Alderman and Sons that was, as best she could determine, a front for Eastern investors looking to consolidate range land in the territory. They held a note for $400 that was due in full 18 months after Thomas's death, and the man who had ridden out to inform her of this fact, a thin-lipped company agent named Corvin, had looked around her property with calculating eyes that made her skin crawl. "We would be willing to negotiate a settlement, Mrs. Hawkins," Corvin had said, in a tone that made settlement sound like something she should be grateful for. "The company has a fair offer prepared." She had told Corvin that she would need to review the original documents, which she had then spent 3 weeks tracking down through a Cheyenne attorney who charged her $6 she could barely spare. And she had discovered that the note had a provision Thomas had apparently not fully understood, a grace period, and a right of redemption that meant she had more time than Corvin had implied. Thomas had not been cheated exactly, but he had not been fully informed either, and the distinction felt razor-thin when she was sitting alone at her kitchen table at midnight reading legal language by the light of a single candle. She had managed. She always managed. That was the thing about Rebecca Hawkins that people in the valley had come to understand, though they had come to it slowly, and not always without resistance. She was not the kind of woman who appeared, on first acquaintance, to be remarkable. She was medium height with brown hair that she kept braided and pinned because there was no practical reason to do otherwise, and she had gray eyes that people sometimes described as cool and sometimes described as clever, depending on whether she was looking at them favorably. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street. She was handsome in a way that required looking at, a face that revealed itself gradually, with a mouth that was generous when she was not being careful about it, and a quality of complete attention when she listened to someone that made them feel, without fully understanding why, that they had said something worth saying. She paid her debts. She attended church on the Sundays she could manage the ride to Clearwater. She kept her fences in reasonable repair and her cattle from wandering onto her neighbor's land. And she maintained the kind of careful distance that a widowed woman alone on a homestead in 1882 Wyoming understood was both protective and necessary. Her neighbors to the south were the Breckenridge family, 3 generations of them crammed into a house that needed a new roof, loud and contentious and warm-hearted in equal measure. Her neighbors to the east were the Caldwell brothers, 2 taciturn men who farmed together with mechanical efficiency, and had never in 3 years said anything to her that she would describe as a complete sentence. And her neighbor to the north, across the creek and 2 miles of good grass, was Patrick Sheridan. She had formed her opinion of Patrick Sheridan in pieces, the way you formed opinions of anyone you saw regularly, but not constantly in the valley. He had arrived in the Clearwater Valley in the spring of 1880, a year before Thomas died, coming up from Colorado with a wagon, a horse, and 2 mules, and he had filed a claim on a section of land that the previous settler had abandoned after a particularly brutal winter. He had built his house and barn himself, which people knew because they had watched him do it, and he had set up a small smithy in the barn because the nearest blacksmith was 16 miles away in Clearwater, and there was, as anyone with working animals understood, a constant and urgent demand for ironwork in cattle country. He was not a man who talked a great deal, but when he talked, people listened, which was a different and more valuable thing. He was perhaps 30 or 32, tall enough that he had to duck slightly through most doorways, with dark hair that he kept just short enough to stay out of his eyes and hands that looked like tools themselves, broad and capable and scored with the small white scars that came from a working life in metal. He had a face that was weathered without being old, the kind of face that had been outside in real weather for real years, and eyes so dark brown they were almost black, which Rebecca had noticed, and then firmly decided she had not particularly noticed. He was unmarried, which the women of the valley had long since stopped speculating about, because Patrick Sheridan gave away absolutely nothing about his interior life to anyone who was not standing very close to him in a moment of genuine crisis. He was courteous to everyone, friendly to most, and intimate with no one, and this was a quality that Rebecca, who was somewhat the same way, had respected without ever saying so. Their relationship, such as it was, had been built on the practical architecture of frontier neighborliness. He had helped her string new fence wire along her north pasture the previous spring when the posts had rotted, and she had not been able to hire anyone. She had sent over a covered dish and a pie when he had mentioned, in passing, that he had been working 16-hour days and barely eating. He had ridden over twice when she had spotted smoke on her property that turned out to be nothing dangerous, and she had ridden over once when she saw that his barn light was burning at 2 in the morning, and discovered that one of his horses was foaling badly, and she had, somewhat surprisingly to both of them, helped deliver the foal without being asked. They talked about practical things: weather, cattle, the price of grain in Clearwater, the condition of the road after the spring rains. They were careful with each other in the specific way that two people are careful when they are aware, even if they will not admit it, that something complicated lives beneath the surface of their ordinary exchanges. And then her harness had broken. It had broken on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883, 3 weeks after the first frost, when she was driving her wagon along the back trail to check on the cattle. She had moved to the north pasture for the fall grazing. The left collar strap had been showing wear for weeks, and she had meant to replace it before it gave out completely, and she had not, because there were 17 other things that needed doing, and the harness had seemed like it could wait one more week. It had not waited. It had snapped clean through when the wagon lurched over a ridge of frozen ground, and her mare had stumbled forward out of the collar and nearly gone down on her knees, and Rebecca had spent 20 minutes getting the horse calmed and the wagon situated before she had stood in the cold morning air and faced the plain fact that she was 2 miles from home and her harness was in 2 pieces. She had unhitched the mare and ridden her back to the homestead and taken stock of the situation with the blunt practicality that characterized her approach to all disasters. She did not have the tools to make a proper repair herself. The mercantile in Clearwater had harness leather but no collar straps of the right size and certainly no ironwork. The logical answer, the answer that required the least amount of pride swallowing, was to ride the 4 miles to Patrick Sheridan's place and ask if he could help. She had known he could. She had seen the quality of his work. She had also known, in a way she did not examine closely, that going to Patrick Sheridan for help felt different from going to anyone else for help, and that the difference made her cautious in a way that annoyed her. She had gone anyway, because the cattle needed checking and the wagon needed its harness, and there was no room in practical frontier life for feelings you had not examined. He had been at his smithy when she arrived, and he had looked up from the iron he was working and said, with no particular surprise, "Rebecca," as if he had been expecting her, which she knew was simply the way he said everything, without excessive inflection, as if all information was equally unsurprising. She had explained about the harness. He had looked at the broken pieces she had brought along in her saddlebag, turned them in his hands with the assessing quality he brought to all things, and said it could be fixed and it would take about 3 hours. She had offered to come back for it. He had said he would have it done before supper time and she could wait if she liked or come back. It was her choice. She had waited, because riding 8 miles in a day when she only needed to ride 4 seemed wasteful, and she had sat on the bench outside his smithy in the October sunlight reading the 3-month-old newspaper she had found on the bench. And he had worked with the focused silence of someone who did not need to fill space with words. And occasionally she had looked up from the newspaper and watched him, and then looked back down at the newspaper with more than the usual attention. He had finished at 4 o'clock, and the work was exactly as remarkable as she had known it would be, and she had reached into her coat pocket for the silver dollar she had prepared, because of course she had prepared it, because you did not accept something for nothing from a neighbor, not when you had a choice about it. And that was when the coin had hit the workbench and his jaw had tightened and everything had shifted. "Neighbors do not keep accounts between them," he said, and the words sat between them in the afternoon light like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "Patrick," she said, and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she meant to say next, which was an unusual and uncomfortable position for her to be in. He picked up the coin and held it out to her. His hand was steady. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she became aware of something she had not been aware of before, or had been aware of and had not let herself look at directly. He was not merely being stubborn about money. There was something in his face that was asking her something, a question that had nothing to do with silver dollars and harness leather. She took the coin back. Her fingers brushed his palm when she did, and neither of them moved for a fraction of a second, and then she stepped back and put the coin in her pocket and said, "Thank you, Patrick," in a voice that was slightly less steady than she would have liked. "You're welcome, Rebecca," he said, in a voice that was very steady indeed, which she found simultaneously reassuring and maddening. She rode home with the Mended harness draped over her saddlebag, and a feeling in her chest that she had not felt in 2 years, something that was almost hope and almost fear and was, she suspected, the beginning of real trouble. The trouble arrived in stages, as trouble usually did. The first stage was purely practical. October deepened toward November, and the valley began its annual preparation for winter with the urgent industriousness of a community that understood exactly what it meant to be caught unprepared in Wyoming in December. Rebecca worked from before sunrise to after sunset every day, winterizing her barn, stacking her wood supply, checking her cattle, preserving what she could from the kitchen garden, and doing the 100 small tasks that separated surviving the winter comfortably from surviving it badly. Patrick Sheridan came by on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the incident with the coin, to tell her that he had noticed the section of fence on her western boundary was listing badly and would not survive a significant snowfall. He said it in the way he said most things, matter of fact and unadorned, standing at her kitchen door with his hat in his hands and a light that was not quite frost, but was beginning to consider it sitting in the air around him. "I thought you should know," he said, "before the weather turns." "I saw it," she said. "I was going to get to it this week." "I have time Thursday afternoon," he said. "If you wanted help." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the dark-eyed calm that she was beginning to find increasingly difficult to think around. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said simply. She made herself hold his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Thursday afternoon," she said. "I would appreciate the help." He nodded once and put his hat back on and walked to his horse and rode away, and Rebecca stood at her kitchen door in the cold air and watched him go with her arms crossed over her chest, and a quiet, unsettled feeling that she recognized with some exasperation as being perfectly helpless against. He came on Thursday afternoon as promised, and they fixed the fence line in a collaboration that was, Rebecca had to admit, remarkably efficient. She had expected, in some vague and slightly ungenerous way, that having help would mean explaining things or waiting for someone to catch up. Patrick Sheridan did not need explaining to and never needed to be waited for. He assessed what needed doing with a single look, asked one clarifying question, and then worked with the kind of easy competence that came from years of learning how to make things functional under difficult conditions. By the time the light was going gray, they had reset 12 posts and restrung 40 yards of wire, and the western fence line was solider than it had been in 2 years. Rebecca made coffee and brought it out to him in the barn, where he was stowing the tools he had brought, and he took the cup and said thank you, and they stood drinking coffee in the failing light, while the horses shifted quietly in their stalls, and the first real cold of the season came down from the mountains to the north. "How are you finding the winter preparation?" he asked. "Better than last year," she said. "I have more wood than I did and the roof was repaired in August. I think it will hold." "Your cattle count?" he asked. 14 going into winter. I lost 3 last year." He nodded. He knew about the 3 she had lost. Most people in the valley knew about most things, which was the nature of a community small enough that everyone's difficulties were, to some extent, public record. "I have a good supply of hay," he said. More than I need for my own stock. If you find yourself short, you are welcome to it." "Patrick," she said, with a slight edge to her voice that she could not entirely suppress. "It is not charity," he said before she could finish. "It is a neighbor telling another neighbor that there is available hay. You would do the same." She would, she realized. She would do exactly the same without thinking of it as charity. She thought about the 3 cattle she had lost the previous winter, thin and miserable in the back field, and she thought about the way the offer sat in the air between them, not like pity but like something offered between equals, and she felt the slight loosening of a knot she had been holding for 2 years. "Thank you," she said. "I will keep that in mind." The second stage of trouble arrived in the form of information she had not been looking for. It was the first Sunday in November, at the Clearwater Church, where she sat in her usual pew near the back and half listened to Pastor Greaves's sermon while her mind went over the week's tasks, and where she overheard, in the social gathering outside after the service, something that stopped every other thought cold. Eliza Breckenridge, the eldest daughter of her southern neighbors, was talking to Clara Moss from the Mercantile, and Rebecca was not eavesdropping. She was simply standing near the church wall waiting for her horse to finish the water he was drinking, when she heard Patrick Sheridan's name and stopped moving entirely. "His wife," Eliza was saying, low and conspiratorial the way young women sometimes were when they were transmitting information they found both fascinating and sad. "She died in Colorado, a few years before he came here. It was a terrible thing, they say. Some kind of accident, though I heard different things about what kind." "He never speaks of it," Clara said. "No," Eliza agreed. "He never does, but Mother says you can see it on him sometimes if you know to look. Something closed off. She thinks that is why he keeps himself so separate." Rebecca moved away before she heard more, because she was not the kind of woman who listened at walls, but the information followed her home like a second rider, quiet and unwanted and impossible to ignore. A wife who had died in Colorado. A dark past that he carried with him in the specific closed-off way she had sensed but never been able to name. A quality of someone who had been through something that had required him to rebuild himself from the inside, which was not so different, she thought, from what she had done herself after Thomas died. Only she suspected his had been harder, because the look she had seen in his eyes on the day of the harness was not the look of a man who had loved moderately. She thought about that for 3 days and then made herself stop thinking about it, because thinking about it was not productive, and Patrick Sheridan's past was his own business and not hers. And the fact that she felt a pulling ache somewhere behind her sternum when she thought about him being alone in Colorado with a grief one knew the details of, was a feeling she was going to manage very carefully. The third stage arrived more dramatically, on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, when the first real snowstorm of the season came down from the north without quite as much warning as it should have, and Rebecca found herself in the north pasture trying to move her cattle back toward the barn before the snow cut visibility to nothing. She had 11 cattle to move and 1 horse, and a wind that was building from the north into something that had real malice in it. And she managed 9 of the 11 before she realized 2 young steers had pushed through a gap in the northern fence line that she had not known was there, into the rough country beyond the pasture boundary, and the snow was now coming horizontally, and she could not see more than 30 yards in any direction. She found the first steer in a draw, half buried in a snowdrift and very unhappy about it but unhurt, and she was trying to get it turned back toward the fence when she heard a horse behind her, and turned to find Patrick Sheridan emerging from the white curtain of the storm on his big gray gelding, his coat white with snow and his face calm in a way that was, at that particular moment, the most welcome sight she had seen since Thomas died. "I saw your barn light from across the creek," he said, which was not entirely logical since her barn light was nowhere near the north pasture, but she did not question it. "I thought you might need a hand. 2 steers got through the fence," she said. "I have one. There is another somewhere north." He nodded and turned his horse without another word, and within 20 minutes He had found the second steer in a stand of cottonwoods along the creek bank and had it moving back toward the fence. And together, they got both animals back through the gap, and then patched the gap with the wire and posts Patrick had apparently brought in his saddlebag, which suggested a level of preparation that indicated he had anticipated this particular problem before she had known she had it. They got back to her barn in near darkness with the storm screaming around them and got the horses stabled and the cattle counted, all 14 present, and then they were standing in her barn in the sudden relative quiet of being out of the wind, and the lantern she had lit threw gold light across the straw and the horses and the settled shapes of the cattle, and Patrick was stamping snow from his boots, and she was shaking it from her coat, and they were both breathing rather harder than usual. And the relief of being safe and warm and inside was something that went all the way down to the bone. "You should not have been out in that," she said, meaning it partly as gratitude and partly as concern, because crossing the creek in that storm had not been a trivial undertaking. "Neither should you," he said, with a slight curve of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was the closest thing to one she had seen from him in the months she had been paying attention. "I had cattle in it," she said. "And I had a neighbor in it," he said, that word again, neighbor. But the way he said it this time was different from the way he had said it over the coin on the workbench. Then it had sounded like a principle. Now it sounded like something more specific, something that had her name already embedded in it. She made him stay for supper because the storm had closed down the road between her place and his, and there was no sensible argument for crossing the creek again in that visibility. He did not protest, which she noted. He sat at her kitchen table while she made biscuits and heated the venison stew she had made 2 days before, and they talked in a different way than they had talked before, less like neighbors exchanging information, and more like two people who were slowly and carefully beginning to let the other one in. He told her about his early years in Colorado, not the part she had overheard Eliza Breckenridge talking about, but the years before that, growing up in County Clare in Ireland, and coming to America at 17 with his brother and $32 between them, working the railroads in Missouri, and then the mines in Colorado before discovering that his real skill was with iron, with making and mending things, with the transformative work of the smithy that turned raw material into something that could hold the world together. He told it with the understated quality she had come to associate with him, without drama or self-pity, as if the story were simply the territory he had crossed to get to where he was. But she heard under the words something she recognized, the particular tone of someone who has been through fire, literal and figurative, and come out the other side still standing, still capable of choosing what came next. He did not talk about his wife. She did not ask. But when she walked him to the door at 9 o'clock, the storm still going strong outside, and he put on his coat and said he thought the creek would be passable by morning, she looked at him in the lamplight of her doorway and felt the full weight of what was building between them settle into her chest like something both heavy and warm, like a stone warmed by a fire, carrying heat long after the flame has moved on. "Patrick," she said. He turned to look at her. She could have said a dozen things. She thought of several. Instead she said, "Thank you for coming out in that. I am grateful." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, clear eyes. "It was not a hardship," he said quietly. "Coming to you." She thought about that sentence all night while the storm howled around the corners of her house, and the warmth of it did not dissipate with the dawn. November deepened. The snowstorm passed and was followed by a week of clear, bitter cold, and then by another storm, smaller than the first but meaningful enough that everyone in the valley hunkered down and made do. Rebecca managed her days with the careful economy of someone who has learned to stretch everything, wood, food, daylight, energy, until there is just enough. She was not in any danger. She had prepared well. But the solitude of a Wyoming winter was a real thing, heavy and close, particularly for someone who had once had another person in the house, and now had only herself, and the sounds of wind and cattle, and the occasional conversation with her mare. Patrick came by twice during that week, once to bring a side of beef from an animal he had slaughtered and did not have room to keep. "Before it goes to waste," he said, with a look that forestalled any argument about charity, and once simply to check on her, which he framed as checking on the fence repairs they had made in the pasture, but which she understood for what it was, and which she found both touching and slightly aggravating, because she was quite capable of surviving without being checked on. She told him so the second time. "I know," he said, standing at her porch in the gray December light. "I know you are capable. That was not why I came." She looked at him. The cold was sharp enough that her breath was visible between them. "Why did you come, then?" she asked, and her voice came out slightly less neutral than she had intended. He was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands again, which she had come to recognize as a sign that he was going to say something that mattered to him. "Because I wanted to see you," he said, straightforward. No preamble, no elaborate construction around the words. Just the fact of it, offered like the hay he had offered, like a neighbor offering what they had available. Rebecca breathed in the cold air and breathed it out again. 2 years of widowhood and careful distance. A coin on a workbench. A storm in the north pasture. Coffee in a failing light and supper in a snowstorm, and small kindnesses exchanged with such deliberate evenness that she had almost convinced herself they were nothing more than what they appeared to be. "I see," she said. "I did not say it to complicate things," he said. "I said it because it is true and because I thought you deserved to know it." "Things are already complicated," she said, before she had quite decided to say it. Something shifted in his face. A small unlocking, very careful, as if he were opening a door that had been closed for a long time and wanted to be sure the hinges still worked. "Yes," he said, "they are." She looked at him for another moment and then said, "Come inside, Patrick. It is too cold to be standing on the porch having this kind of conversation." He came inside, and they had coffee again, and they talked for 2 hours about everything except the thing they had just acknowledged was between them. And that was all right, she thought, because acknowledging it at all was already more than she had done in 2 years, and there was no rush, and the winter was long, and some things deserved to be approached slowly. The thing that changed the pace was Corvin. He arrived on a Tuesday in late December, the same thin-lipped company agent who had ridden out after Thomas died, and this time he had a companion with him, a large man with a careful, watchful quality who did not introduce himself, and Corvin had paper in his hands when he knocked on her door, and the particular smile that she associated with people who believed they had a trap already sprung. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, "I hope this is not an inconvenient time." "It is December," she said, "and you are from a land company in Cheyenne. It is always an inconvenient time." Corvin's smile did not waver. He was, she gave him that, a man of considerable professional composure. He told her, with the smoothness of someone who had delivered this kind of information before, that Alderman and Sons had reviewed the terms of Thomas's note, and that the attorney she had consulted in Cheyenne had apparently miscommunicated the terms of the right of redemption, and that the grace period was, in fact, considerably shorter than she had been led to believe, and that the note was, in fact, substantially overdue. She did not let him see her go cold inside. She kept her face exactly as it was, calm and slightly narrowed at the eyes, the look she had developed for situations that required her to think faster than she felt. "I will need to see the documents," she said. He had the documents. He handed them to her with the satisfied air of a man who had expected her to have nothing to say to them. She took them and read them carefully, which took 20 minutes, during which neither Corvin nor the large unnamed companion moved from her parlor, and she saw that the documents were, on their face, exactly what Corvin claimed they were. She also saw a discrepancy, small but real, a date that did not match the date on the redemption agreement her Cheyenne attorney had given her, a 1-month difference that was either a clerical error or something deliberate. She did not know enough law to know which, and she knew that her attorney was in Cheyenne and she was in Clearwater Valley in December, and there was 6 inches of snow on the ground and the nearest telegraph was 16 miles away. "I will need time to consult with my attorney," she said. "Of course," Corvin said, in a tone that meant anything but. "We can allow 30 days." After they left, she stood in her parlor with the documents in her hand and felt the specific, sickening fear of someone who can see a threat very clearly but cannot yet see the path around it. She had paid against the note. She had made payments that Thomas had begun, keeping careful records. She had almost gotten clear of it, and now this. She did not cry. She was not generally a crying person. She sat at her table and went through the documents again, and then went through her own records, which she kept in a cedar box Thomas had made, meticulous and complete because she had been raised by a schoolteacher who believed in the importance of writing things down, and she found what she had been looking for in her own records: a receipt. A receipt for a payment she had made in July, a payment that Corvin's documents showed as never received, and the receipt was dated and signed by the agent who had come to collect it, a different agent, a man named Hollies who had given her a proper written receipt, and she had kept it because she kept everything. She sat very still for a moment, and then she put on her coat and her boots and went out to saddle her horse. She had not decided exactly to go to Patrick Sheridan. She had decided to go to Clearwater to send a telegram to her attorney, which required passing the road that went by his property. And when she reached the turn, she pulled the horse up and sat for a moment in the cold December light, and then turned up the smaller road because she decided, allowed to want another person's counsel when someone was trying to take her land. He was at his smithy, as he almost always was in the daytime, and he came out when he heard her horse, and she told him what had happened without preamble, because there was no version of this story that benefited from circling. He listened without interrupting. He had that quality very developed, the ability to listen with complete attention without fidgeting or rushing ahead, or making the kind of murmuring noises that some people made when they were listening but were actually composing their response. He just listened, and when she finished he said, "Show me the date discrepancy." She showed him. He studied it for longer than she expected, and she watched his face do something careful and methodical, a man working through a problem the way he worked through iron, with patient and focused attention to its structure. "This is their signature on the receipt," he said, pointing to the July payment receipt. "Holly's the agent," she said. "And this is Corvin's signature on their version of the payment record." "Yes. They are different handwriting," he said. She looked more carefully. He was right. She had been so focused on the date that she had not looked at the signatures. They were different handwriting because they were different men, which made sense. But the payment record Corvin had shown her had a note that said no payment received for July, in Corvin's own hand, which meant either Hollies had not reported the payment to the company or Corvin had hidden it. "He is trying to erase a payment," Patrick said, and his voice had gone very flat and very clear, the way she had heard voices go when something made a man genuinely angry but he was too disciplined to let it out except in the temperature of his tone. "Yes," she said, "I believe so." "You need your attorney," he said. "I need to send a telegram to Cheyenne," she said, "and until your attorney can respond," she looked at him. "I hold the receipt," she said. "That is something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a man in Clearwater, a retired judge named Aldous Crane. He does not practice law anymore, but he knows it, and he is not beholden to anyone in particular. He is worth speaking to before you send the telegram, if only to understand what you are dealing with." She had not known about Aldous Crane. She said so. "He keeps a low profile," Patrick said. "He came out here to be quiet. But he is still sharp, and he has seen these land company tactics before, particularly from the eastern investors who have been moving through Wyoming this past few years." They rode to Clearwater together, which was not something they had done before, and the ride was cold and brisk, and mostly quiet except for the practical exchanges about directions and the conversation with Judge Crane that they were preparing for. And yet there was something about it, the two of them moving through the snow-bright landscape together with a shared purpose, that felt different from everything that had come before. Less careful, more like simply being two people who were on the same side. Aldous Crane was a small man with enormous white eyebrows and a mind like a spring trap, and he looked at Rebecca's documents for 12 minutes without speaking and then looked up and said, with the satisfied air of someone who has found a flaw in an argument he suspected was coming, "This is fraudulent." He explained it with careful precision. The date discrepancy was not a clerical error. The specific number had been altered. He could see it in the ink. A 2 had been changed to a 3, changing the month of the redemption window. And the suppression of the July payment, which her receipt proved, meant that Alderman and Sons had been manipulating the account to make her appear in default when she was not. "This is not unusual behavior from these companies," Crane said, without particular emotion, as if this were simply a fact about the landscape. "They do this to isolated homesteaders who they expect will not be able to navigate the legal process. They expect you to either not have the receipt or not know it matters." "I kept everything," Rebecca said. "That saved you," Crane said. "A telegram to Cheyenne, your attorney, immediately. And I will write a letter myself, which should clarify for Alderman and Sons that this valley is not without legal resources." She sent the telegram. Crane wrote his letter. Patrick stood beside her at the telegraph office and did not try to do anything for her that she could do herself, which she noticed and valued greatly. The response from Cheyenne came 4 days later, and it was everything Crane had predicted. Her attorney was furious and capable, and had, it turned out, been watching Alderman and Sons for other reasons entirely, related to similar tactics used on homesteaders in 2 other Wyoming counties. The matter was referred to the Territorial Land Office, and Corvin did not return to Clearwater Valley, and by February, Rebecca received a letter confirming that her note had been fully satisfied per her records, and the lien on her property was discharged. She stood at her kitchen table holding that letter and breathed, slowly and deliberately, until the shaking in her hands stopped. She had not realized she had been holding her breath for 2 years. Patrick came by that evening, which she had half expected and half hoped for without quite admitting either, and she met him at the door with the letter in her hand. He read it and looked up at her, and for a moment his face did something she had not seen it do before, an expression that was, she realized with a slight shock, something very close to the specific relief of someone whose own fear has been answered, not merely a witness to hers. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He was still holding the letter. She was still standing in the doorway. The February night was achingly cold and absolutely clear, the kind of night where the stars were so bright they seemed close enough to catch, and the snow on the ground reflected them back so that it seemed like standing between 2 skies. "Rebecca," he said and stopped. She waited. "I have been wanting to say something for some time," he said carefully, "and I have been weighing it against whether it was the right time to say it, and I am no longer confident there will be a better time than this one." "Then say it," she said, with a directness that she saw from the slight change in his expression that he had not quite expected even from her. He looked at her. The starlight was very clear. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been in love with you for considerably longer than I have been willing to say so. And I think you know that this is not a simple thing for me to say, given everything. But you are the most extraordinary person I have met in this valley or anywhere else I have been, and the thought of you facing that situation with Corvin, or any situation, without knowing that I would stand behind you in whatever way you would accept, that thought is not one I am willing to keep living with." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was pressing in from behind him, real and immediate, and she was standing in her warm doorway, and the letter from the land office was in his hand, and there was about 2 feet of space between them. "Patrick Sheridan," she said, with a quality in her voice that was somewhere between warmth and a slight, useful sternness, "you are standing in the cold and I am standing in a warm doorway. Come inside." He came inside. She made coffee because it was what she did, and because her hands needed something to do, and because the ordinary familiar motions of the kitchen helped her think. He sat at her table and watched her with an attention that she was no longer trying to pretend she did not feel, and when she set the cups down and sat across from him, she looked at him directly and said what was true. "I am not simple about this either," she said. "I am not a simple person generally, and this particular situation after Thomas, after these 2 years of managing everything by myself and learning how to be alone and deciding that being alone was a workable condition, is not simple, but—" She paused. She was not a woman who said things she had not meant to say. This one she had meant to say for a while. "I think I am also in love with you, and have been for some time, and I did not particularly plan that, but here it is." Patrick looked at her with an expression that held, finally, something she had never seen on his face in all the months she had been watching it. Something open, something that did not have a wall behind it. "Is that so?" He said softly. "That is entirely so," she said. "And before you say anything further, I need you to understand that I am not a woman who intends to disappear into another person. I have my own land and my own ways of doing things, and I am not going to become someone who needs to be taken care of." "I know that," he said. "I have never for a single moment thought you needed to be taken care of. I would simply like to be the person who is beside you while you do everything you are going to do anyway." She absorbed that for a moment. The precision of it. The way he had said it without trying to soften anything or reframe her character to make it more convenient. "That," she said, "is a very good answer." The winter moved through its remaining months with a new quality, as if the landscape itself knew that something had shifted. They did not rush. Neither of them was built for rushing, and the frontier in winter did not encourage it, and they were both old enough and had both been through enough to understand that the things worth having were worth approaching with attention. He came to supper twice a week, and she came to his place for supper once a week, and they traded the pattern back and forth with the kind of easy reciprocity that she thought was, in some ways, more telling than anything they said. They talked about everything: history, politics, books when they had them, the territory's steady movement towards statehood, the rights of the native peoples who had been pushed from this land, which Patrick had strong opinions about and which she found she shared, shaped by her father's school teaching and her own observation of the injustice that lived so close beneath the surface of all the Western expansion rhetoric. They talked about his wife. It happened one night in January, naturally, without her asking, when they were sitting near her stove after supper, and he had gone quiet in a particular way she had learned to recognize as something he was working up to. Her name had been Nora. She had come from Galway, like him, and they had married in Missouri and gone west together, full of the specific young optimism of people who believed that work and love were enough to build anything. She had died in a mining accident in Colorado, a collapse in a tunnel shaft that had taken 7 men, and Nora had been in the vicinity for reasons that were heartbreaking in their simplicity. She had brought Patrick his midday meal because she always brought him his midday meal, and she had been in the wrong place at the moment when the earth had decided it was going to move. He told it quietly, without the kind of visible grief that had to be performed. The grief had been performed years ago, privately, in ways that had nearly broken him. What remained was the settled sadness of someone who has made peace with something they will never entirely be at peace with, which is a different and more survivable condition. "I came here," he said, "because I needed to be somewhere new, not to forget her. I do not think I am supposed to forget her, but somewhere that did not have her absence in every corner." "I understand that," Rebecca said. "I understand that very well." He looked at her across the quiet space between their chairs. "I know you do," he said. "That is part of why I am talking to you about it." She reached across and put her hand over his, which was the most deliberate and unambiguous gesture she had made in 2 years, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the firelight without saying anything else, which was, she thought, a very particular kind of intimacy, the kind that did not need words because the words had already done their work. Spring came to the Clearwater Valley with the slow, dramatic urgency that Wyoming springs always had, as if the land had been holding its breath for months and was now releasing everything at once. The creek ran high and loud with snowmelt, and the grass came up green and eager, and the sky went from the flat white of winter to a blue so vivid it almost hurt to look at it, and the whole valley moved from the defensive crouch of winter to the expansive, urgent business of spring in a matter of weeks. Patrick helped her with her spring fencing, as he had the previous year, but this year it was different because this year they had stopped pretending that the help was merely practical, and they worked side by side in the warm April sun with a comfort and a naturalness that came from knowing each other in a deeper way, and the work got done faster for it, as work often does when the people doing it are not spending any energy being careful about what they feel. One afternoon in late April, with the harness hanging in her barn, mended and whole, and her cattle out in the spring grass and her property free and clear of any lien, Patrick set down his fence pliers and looked at her with the expression she now knew meant he had decided to say something important. "I would like," he said in his careful, deliberate way, "to ask you something." She straightened up and looked at him, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Ask," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because it is practical, though it may be, and not because of anything except that I want to spend my time with you. On your terms or on terms we figure out together, however it makes the most sense for you." Rebecca Hawkins looked at Patrick Sheridan in the spring afternoon with the mountains visible to the north and the creek running loud in the distance and 12 years of frontier life in her bones, 12 years of learning what she was made of and what she needed, and what she was willing to bend on and what she was not, and she felt something settle in her with a completeness she had not expected and could not have planned for. "I think it is considerably more than practical," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is considerably more." "Then yes," she said, "on terms we figure out together." He smiled, and it was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand, in a sudden and clarifying flash, exactly how much of himself he had been keeping carefully contained for years, how much warmth and light had been in there behind the deliberate calm all along, waiting for somewhere safe to go. She walked toward him and he met her halfway, and when he kissed her, it was neither tentative nor rushed, but something exactly right, full of the same quality he brought to all his work, total presence and care, and an attention to what was actually happening that made everything feel solid and real. They were married in June of 1884 in the Clearwater Church, with Pastor Greaves officiating and virtually the entire valley present, because Patrick Sheridan and Rebecca Hawkins were both, in their own separate ways, people the valley had been watching for some time, and the general consensus was that this was correct and overdue and very satisfying in the way that right things are satisfying. The Breckenridge family came in force, 3 generations of them filling an entire pew, and Eliza Breckenridge cried in the frank, uncomplicated way of someone who is moved by things and does not feel the need to apologize for it. The Caldwell brothers sat in the back and did not say anything during the service, which was consistent with their general approach to existence, but they shook Patrick's hand afterward with visible warmth and wished Rebecca well with the most words she had ever heard either of them string together. Judge Crane, small and white-eyebrowed and sharp-minded, sat near the front and watched the proceedings with an expression that suggested he approved of good outcomes, which this was. Rebecca wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool with a pattern she had planned for 2 months, and she wore her hair down for the first time in years. And Patrick, who had apparently owned a good coat all along but had simply never had occasion to wear it, stood at the front of the church with a calm that was different from his usual calm, less contained, and more like genuine peace, and when she came down the aisle toward him his face did that open, unguarded thing that she already loved with a ferocity that surprised her. They said the words. They meant every one of them. After the wedding, they went back to her property, which had been agreed as the place they would build from, because it was closer to the creek and the bottomland was better, and Patrick's smithy could be moved over time or rebuilt. And they had discussed this with the same practical clarity they brought to all decisions between them, and the decision had been made without difficulty. His brother Seamus came from Colorado for the wedding and stayed a week, a man who was physically very like Patrick but louder and more expressive, who laughed at everything and told stories about their childhood in Clare with the unself-conscious delight of someone for whom the past was a treasury rather than a weight. He and Rebecca took to each other immediately, which Patrick watched with a quiet satisfaction that was very visible to anyone paying attention. "She is nothing like I expected," Seamus told Patrick privately on the second evening when they were on the porch and Rebecca was inside talking to Eliza Breckenridge. "What did you expect?" Patrick said. "Someone softer," Seamus said. "You were always careful with soft things. You always handled them like you were afraid of breaking them." Patrick considered this. "She does not need to be handled," he said. "That is the thing, she handles herself. I simply get to be there." Seamus looked at him for a long moment and then nodded with great deliberateness. "Good," he said. "That is the right answer. You needed someone who did not need you to be careful." The summer of 1884 was a good one. Not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect in cattle country, but good in the specific way that years are good when the work is meaningful, and the person you come home to is someone you chose deliberately and well. They developed the easy domestic rhythms of two people who have both lived alone long enough to have strong opinions about how things should be done, and have also lived long enough to know which opinions to hold and which to release. She kept her records. He kept the smithy running, which had moved to her property's north barn by September, rebuilt with the methodical competence that characterized everything he did. She continued to manage the cattle operation with the intelligence she had brought to it since Thomas died, and he added to it with the capital his smithy income generated, and with 2 more horses and a proper equipment setup that made the fall work significantly more efficient than it had been. They talked every evening, sometimes about the property and sometimes about the wider world, the news that came through the Clearwater paper weeks after events, and the conversations they had with travelers moving through the territory. Patrick had opinions about labor rights and about the treatment of the Chinese workers who had built the railroads and had been repaid with exclusion laws. Rebecca had opinions about women's suffrage, which Wyoming territory had, remarkably, granted in 1869, and which she regarded as a minimum rather than a ceiling. They argued sometimes, with the engaged, curious argument of people who respect each other's minds, and they never argued with cruelty, and they never left anything unresolved overnight, which was a rule they had made early and kept carefully. In the winter of 1884, sitting at their kitchen table by the lamplight on a December evening very like the evenings they had spent before they were married, Rebecca told him she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment. She watched his face with the careful attention she had developed for reading what he was actually feeling, and she saw it, under the first wave of whatever his face was doing, something that was not simple. She had known it might not be simple. The child he and Nora had been expecting when she died had died with her. She had learned this from Seamus, not from Patrick, and she had held it very carefully because it was a wound she did not want to accidentally open. "Patrick," she said. He looked at her, and his eyes were very bright, and she saw that the not simple thing in his face was not grief, but rather the specific kind of emotion that comes when something you had stopped hoping for arrives, and the prohibition you had placed on the hoping suddenly has nowhere to go. "Good," he said, very quietly. He paused. "That is very good." She reached across the table and held his hand, as she had held it that night in January by her stove, and he turned it over and held hers back, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight of their kitchen, while the winter dark pressed at the windows and the fire kept time against it. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly, "but not very, are you?" "Yes," he said, equally honest, "but in a way that feels correct." In August of 1885, their son was born, a large, loud, healthy boy whom they named Thomas Patrick Sheridan. Thomas for the man Rebecca had buried and Patrick for the man who had mended what she had not known needed mending. And they carried him home from the neighboring farmwife who had served as midwife, wrapped in a blanket Rebecca had made over the winter, and set him in the cradle Patrick had built in the smithy from a particular piece of wood he had been saving. And they looked at him together in the August evening light, with a feeling that was too large for any word Rebecca knew in English, or that Patrick knew in English or Irish. "He has your eyes," Patrick said. "He has your chin," Rebecca said. They looked at each other and laughed quietly, the full and easy laugh of people who do not need to perform happiness because they are actually having it. Thomas was not a quiet baby, which surprised neither of them, as he had clearly inherited opinions from both sides, and the house, which had been orderly and methodical, acquired the specific energetic disorder of a house with a small child in it, and both of them adapted to this with better grace than they had expected. Patrick, who had seemed at first an unlikely candidate for the chaos of infancy, turned out to have a quality with the baby that was the same quality he had with difficult iron: infinite patience, total attention, and a competence that looked effortless because it was built on real care. The valley watched them with the proprietary warmth that communities sometimes develop for people they had been rooting for without quite admitting it. The Breckenridges came by to see the baby within a week of his birth, and left a ham and 4 pies, and Eliza cried again. The Caldwell brothers arrived unannounced one morning and left a carved wooden horse on the porch, which Rebecca found when she opened the door, with no note because the Caldwells did not write notes, and she looked at it for a moment and felt a warmth for her taciturn neighbors that she would have found difficult to articulate, but that was real. Judge Crane sent a letter of congratulations that was 3 paragraphs of genuine sentiment and 1 paragraph of legal advice about ensuring the property registration was properly updated to reflect both their names, which was both touching and characteristically practical, and which she acted on immediately. The years moved in the way that good years in good places move, with the full freight of living, difficulty and beauty and loss and discovery, but with the particular quality of years that have a solid center. In the spring of 1887 they had a daughter, whom they named Claire Mary Sheridan, Claire for the county in Ireland that Patrick carried with him and Mary for Rebecca's mother. And she was small and ferociously alert from the first hour, and Patrick looked at her with an expression that Rebecca thought she would remember for the rest of her life. A man encountering something he had not had words for, and discovering that he did not need words, that the feeling itself was its own sufficient language. Thomas, who was 2, was not entirely sure about Claire Mary at first, but came around within a week when he discovered that she would reliably look at him when he made noise, which was, for a 2-year-old, a deeply satisfying power. In 1888, Wyoming's push toward statehood accelerated, and Patrick and Rebecca were among the people in Clearwater Valley who attended the meeting at which the territory's future was debated with passion and occasionally considerable noise. Patrick spoke twice, once about the importance of ensuring that the new state's constitution protected land rights against the kind of corporate manipulation that had nearly cost Rebecca her property, and once about the Chinese community in Laramie, whose members had been subjected to violence in 1885, 3 years earlier, violence that had been discussed at the time as a shameful chapter, and then largely set aside by those who had not been its targets. He spoke about it with the blunt directness of someone who had himself been an immigrant, and who understood, in the bone, the specific vulnerability of people whose rights were considered optional by those in power. Rebecca had watched him from across the meeting room. This man she had known for 8 years now and been married to for 4, and felt the particular pride that comes not from reflected glory, but from genuine recognition, from seeing someone be exactly who you knew them to be in a public context that required it of them. They walked home in the dark after the meeting, Thomas asleep in the wagon and Claire Mary curled against Rebecca's side, and the night was warm and the stars were out, and the road through the valley was familiar enough to be navigated in the dark. "You spoke well," she said. "I said what was true," he said. "That is usually how it works when you speak," she said, and she heard him smile in the dark, a slight shift in his breathing that she knew as well as she knew the sound of her own name. Wyoming became a state in 1890, the 44th in the Union, and the celebration in Clearwater was enthusiastic and somewhat overwhelming. And Rebecca and Patrick attended it with their children and their neighbors, and the accumulated weight of a decade of making something real in this valley. And when the statehood was formally announced, and the crowd cheered with the full-throated roar of people who feel they belong to something, Rebecca found Patrick's hand in the noise and held it, and he held hers back. And neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Thomas was 5 by then and deeply invested in the proceedings in the way of 5-year-olds, loudly and physically, and with questions that could not all be answered simultaneously. Claire Mary was 3 and sat on Patrick's shoulders and looked around at everything with her mother's gray eyes and her father's serious attention. They were good children in the way that children are good when they are loved straightforwardly and given room to be who they are. In the years that followed statehood, the valley grew. New families came, some from the east, some from other states, some from further away, and the community around Clearwater expanded and diversified and brought with it the pleasures and complications that expansion always brings. Rebecca found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, becoming one of the people that new arrivals sought out, a woman who had been here long enough to know things, who had navigated enough difficulty to be a useful guide, who had the quality her father had of being able to explain things without condescension. She did not stop managing her own operation to do this. She did both, as she had always done multiple things at once. Patrick, whose smithy had grown to employ a young apprentice by 1890, a quiet boy from a newly arrived German family named Werner, understood this about her, and supported it with the same uncomplicated completeness with which he supported everything she decided to do. They had a third child in 1892, another son, whom they named Daniel Seamus Sheridan, Daniel because Rebecca's father had loved Daniel Webster and Seamus for Patrick's brother. And Daniel was fair where Thomas was dark and quiet, where Thomas was loud and deeply interested in the natural world, collecting rocks and tracking animal prints, and asking questions about the mountains to the north that the valley could see, but that most of the valley's children had not yet been to. Patrick took Thomas and Daniel both to the mountains in the summer of 1895, a 3-day trip into the high country above the valley, and came back with 2 boys who were sunburned and full of stories, and a conviction that the mountains were the most extraordinary thing they had ever seen. And Rebecca listened to all of it over supper and looked across the table at Patrick, who was letting the boys do the talking but who had a look in his eyes that she recognized as happiness of the kind that had nowhere to put itself except on his face. That night, after the children were asleep, she said, "Thank you for taking them." He looked at her. "They needed to see it," he said, "the country up there, where this all started before any of us were here." "I know," she said. "Come next time," he said. "All of us." "All of us," she agreed. They did go the following summer, all 5 of them on horseback, Claire Mary on a small sure-footed pony that Patrick had selected for her with considerable care, and they spent 4 days in the high country, camping in a meadow above the tree line where the world went vast and quiet, and the scale of the land put everything else into perspective. Thomas caught a trout in a mountain stream and was insufferably proud of it. Daniel filled his pockets with rocks and had to be told twice that the horse could not carry all of them. Claire Mary sat on a boulder above the meadow in the late afternoon light and looked out at the view with her serious gray eyes and said nothing for a very long time, and then said, "It is very big, Papa." "It is," Patrick said. It makes me feel both very small and very important at the same time, she said, with the precision of a child who had inherited from both her parents the habit of saying exactly what she meant. That, Patrick said, is exactly the correct feeling to have about it. They rode back down to the valley on the fourth day, 5 people in a line on horseback through the aspen groves that were beginning their autumn color change, the gold trembling in a light wind above them. And Rebecca, who was riding third in the line behind Patrick and Thomas, looked at the back of her husband's head, at the gray that had come into his dark hair in the past few years, at the easy way he sat his horse, at the way he turned to check on Thomas with the same watchful calm he turned on everything he cared about, and she felt a fullness in her chest that she did not try to name because it was too large for naming. She had not planned for this. She had not planned for Patrick Sheridan or for the coin that had rung on a workbench or for the 8 words that had shifted everything. She had planned to survive, to hold her land, to live with dignity and practicality, and without needing more than she could honestly provide for herself. She had planned a workable life, not a full one. She had been wrong about what she needed, and she was grateful, every single day, for the specific way she had been wrong about it. The autumn of 1897 brought Werner, Patrick's apprentice, to the door with a proposal for Claire Mary, who was now 10 and absolutely not eligible for proposals, which Werner, who was 16, had not quite thought through. And this was handled with such diplomatic dexterity by Patrick, who managed not to laugh until Werner was well down the road, that it became a family story retold at every possible occasion for years afterward. Claire Mary, when informed of what had transpired, was appalled and then amused and then thoughtful in the way she was thoughtful about things, and said, "Werner is very kind, but he should finish growing before he makes propositions," which was both accurate and, given that she was 10, remarkably level-headed. Thomas, who was 12 and deeply invested in the drama of everything, provided commentary that required Patrick to leave the room, because he could not maintain the appropriate parental gravity while it was happening. Daniel, who was 5, asked if Werner had brought a horse, and when told that he had not, lost interest in the entire affair immediately. In 1898, Rebecca's mother came to visit from Laramie, where her father had died the previous year, and where she was now living with Rebecca's older sister. Marguerite Aldine was 63 years old and entirely herself, sharp-minded and warm-hearted and full of opinions about everything she saw, and she arrived on the stage from Laramie with a trunk full of books and a quality of looking at everything that Rebecca recognized as the source of her own way of seeing the world. She met Patrick with the frank assessing gaze she brought to all new people, and Patrick met her with the calm that he brought to all situations. And within 2 hours of her arrival, they were sitting at the kitchen table disagreeing, in a companionable and engaged way, about the management of the Wyoming legislature, which Marguerite thought was full of men who needed better education and Patrick thought was full of men who needed better priorities. And Rebecca sat across from them both and watched them and felt, with a completeness that was almost startling, the shape of the life she was living. Her mother stayed 3 weeks. Before she left, she took Rebecca's hands in hers one morning in the kitchen and looked at her with the directness that was the family characteristic and said, "You have done very well here. Your father would have been proud of you. I am proud of you." "Thank you, Mama," Rebecca said. "And that husband of yours," her mother said with a smile that contained both approval and slight mischief, "is the best kind of man. The kind who is strong enough to let you be strong. That kind is rarer than it should be." "I know," Rebecca said. "Your father was that kind," her mother said. "And I had 40 years with him. I hope you have 40 years with yours." Rebecca looked at the window, through which she could see Patrick in the yard, showing Daniel something about the fence post they were repairing, Daniel serious and attentive in his way, Patrick patient and clear in his, the two of them bent over the same problem with the same quality of focused interest. "I hope so too," she said. "I intend to make the most of every one of them." Marguerite patted her hands and went to pack her trunk, and Rebecca stood at the window a moment longer watching her husband and her youngest son in the morning light. And then she went out to join them, because that was who she was, someone who went out to be part of things rather than watching them from the inside. And when she came up beside Patrick, he looked at her with those dark eyes that had never stopped being the most entirely present eyes she had ever looked into, and he said nothing. Just shifted slightly so there was room for her beside him at the fence post, and she stepped into that space as naturally as breathing, as if it had been made for her, and they worked on the fence. Together, the three of them in the Wyoming morning, while the mountain stood to the north and the creek ran in the east and the grass came up green from the good bottomland soil. And the life they had built, deliberate and hard-won and entirely their own, held them firmly in its hands. 20 years after a silver dollar had rung on a workbench, and a man with dark eyes and careful hands had pushed it back, and said that neighbors did not keep accounts between them, the Sheridan homestead in the Clearwater Valley was a thing that had grown through all the seasons of effort and love and practical difficulty, and joy that a life properly lived contains. The house was larger, a room added when Thomas was born and another when Claire Mary came, and a proper parlor put on the front that Rebecca had always wanted and had accepted after 3 years of Patrick waiting for her to say so. The smithy was a real operation now, Werner a full partner, and the apprentices he trained a small contribution to the mechanical competence of the valley. The cattle herd was 32 head, well managed and healthy. The bottomland by the creek was under cultivation for hay, and the hay was good. Thomas was 20 by then, and reading law through correspondence with a Cheyenne attorney, because he had gotten his mother's taste for how things worked and his father's conviction that things should work justly, and he was going to do something with both. Claire Mary was 17 and had her father's dark coloring and her mother's gray eyes, which was a combination that commanded attention, and she had their combined stubbornness and their combined intelligence, and she was going to be entirely formidable in whatever direction she chose. Daniel was 13 and still collecting rocks, and had recently announced his intention to study geology, which his parents supported with complete sincerity, because they had both learned that intention stated at 13 sometimes meant exactly what it said. On a Sunday evening in October, with the light going amber in the way it did in autumn and the first suggestion of frost in the night air, Rebecca and Patrick sat on the porch of the house they had built together and watched the mountains turn purple and gold in the last of the sunlight, and the valley stretched out below them in the quiet efficiency of its own life. And the sounds from inside the house were the sounds of their children doing the things their children did, Thomas at his reading, Claire Mary in some involved domestic project, Daniel almost certainly looking at rocks. "Do you ever think about that first winter?" Rebecca said, not for any particular reason. Just because the light had reminded her of it. "Which part of it?" he said. "The night of the snowstorm," she said, "when you came across the creek." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think about it." "Were you frightened, crossing in that weather?" "Of the creek," he said. "No, of arriving and finding you already in trouble before I got there." "Yes." She looked at him. He was 50 or near enough to it, and the gray in his hair was considerable now, and the weathering of 30 years of outdoor work had deepened in his face, and he was still the most completely present person she had ever sat next to, the person whose quality of attention to any given moment made that moment feel more real, as if he pulled whatever he looked at into sharper focus simply by looking. "I was very glad you came," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell. For you that was quite a strong expression of gratitude." "I said thank you," she said, with mild dignity. "You said it with unusual feeling," he said, and the slight, contained smile that she had once waited months to see, and that was now as familiar to her as anything in the world, crossed his face. And she felt, despite 20 years and 3 children, and every kind of difficulty and pleasure that 2 decades of marriage in Wyoming brought, The same precise warmth that she had felt on that February night when he had said, "I would simply like to be the person who is beside you while you do everything you are going to do anyway." "Patrick," she said. "Rebecca," he said. "I am glad," she said, "about all of it, about the harness breaking and the storm and the coin on the workbench and all of it. I am glad it went the way it went." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, as he had done on that first January night, and held it in his warm, work-hardened grip, and they sat together in the October evening, and watched the light fail over the mountains while inside their house, their children moved through the particular and unrepeatable lives they were building. And the valley below them held its animals and its fields and its creek, and all its gathered history of people making do and making something. And the stars began to come through the darkening sky one by one, and the night came on as it always did, quietly and completely, and the two of them sat in it together, which was where they had always, it turned out, been going. The harness hung in the barn, mended and whole, and the silver dollar was somewhere at the bottom of a cedar box full of important papers, and the accounts between neighbors in the Clearwater Valley remained, as they should be, entirely uncalculated, freely given and freely received, because some things could not be measured and should not be, and the full, real life built on that understanding was its own sufficient answer to every question of worth that the world cared to ask.